partner, reach!
Hi, fellas.
Roy Rogers!
See, that's a pretty tricky hat, isn't it? Partners, how would you like to surprise your pals like that? Well, you can with my new Roy Rogers quick shooter hat. It's by Ideal. And here's how the quick shooter hat works. Just press this secret button right here, and a replica of an authentic Western pistol pops out and fires. It's your secret weapon, even when they think you're unarmed. So get Ideal's new Roy Rogers quick shooter hat at your favorite store today, and you'll always be ready for anything. Ask for Ideal's new Roy Rogers quick shooter hat.
I've been doing this long enough that certain themes have presented themselves in these videos, some to be expected and others, well, not so much. One of the strangers is my apparent latent obsession with the cowboy and Western lifestyle. And so we're dedicating this episode of Media Lost to the cowboy as a pop culture phenomenon, and looking at comics featuring the most famous cowboy of all. The cowboy stands as one of the most recognizable symbols in American iconography, largely because of how it's been portrayed and marketed. This accepted image has been informed by years of fabrication, a fantasy that can't be trusted as a true representation of life in the West. America's infatuation with the cowboy began in the 1860s with the advent of the dime novel, one of the nation's first forms of mass entertainment. These stories were geared towards young men and featured rugged heroes and outlaws, damsels in distress, all the while romanticizing America's colonizing of the West. The exploits of real people were often glorified and fictionalized, one of the most prominent being Buffalo Bill Cody. Cody was a frontiersman whose story was sensationalized by novelist Ned Buntline in the serial Buffalo Bill, the King of the Bordermen. Buntline, like his contemporary Prentice Ingram, was a mythmaker. Both took Cody's experience and spun him into the larger-than-life persona remembered today. It was meeting Buntline that led to Cody creating his famous Wild West show, a traveling performance troupe that reenacted his supposed feats. The production also featured other attractions and performers. Cast members included Carlos Montezuma, an indigenous activist and founding member of the Society of American Indians, rodeo stuntman Bill Pickett, and possibly the show's most popular act, sharpshooter Annie Oakley. The introduction of the pulp magazine rendered dime novels obsolete, but the stories they had contained captured the nation's imagination. Advancement in technology changed the way these stories could be told. Cowboy and Western shows were staples of early radio and television broadcasting. Shows like Gunsmoke, Rawhide, and Bonanza were just a few of the 26 Western-themed primetime programs airing in 1959. In film, director John Ford's 1939 landmark Stagecoach made actor John Wayne a Hollywood star, forever associating him with the cowboy. However, he had spent the previous decade starring in several low-budget B-westerns, and was one of the earliest examples of a singing cowboy. And now this was a subgenre of the western that featured the cowboy archetype expressing themselves through song. Think campfires, ranches, home on the range. While some iconic cowboy actors portrayed singing roles, there were others who made careers out of this gimmick. Examples of the singing cowboy include Roy Rogers, who brought a clause into a studio contract that allowed him to keep his likeness and name for merchandising, and would go on to lend his image to a chain of fast food restaurants. Or Herb Jeffries, Hollywood's first cowboy of color, whose films include The Two-Man Gun from Harlem and The Bronze Buckaroo. But the most famous singing cowboy was Gene Autry. He embodied everything we perceived a cowboy to be, appearing on radio, television, and in 93 movies. He was a pioneer of country music and developed the Cowboy Code, a philosophy intended to impart positive values on his impressionable listeners. Like Roy Rogers, Autry lent his likeness to several products, including the inspiration for this video, comics. Gene Autry comics were first published by Fawcett in 1941, but Dell Comics took over in 1944. At one time, Dell was publishing over 1 million copies per month. Now we are looking at issue 64 from 1952. Artists working with Dell were not allowed to sign their work, but I did a little bit of research and found Jesse Marsh, famous for his work on Tarzan, drew a lot of comics in this series, while stories were composed by Paul S. Newman and Buck Rogers creator Duck Calkins, just to name a few of the people who worked on this. All the expected tropes are there: scouting, a band of outlaws, trouble with the railroad. They were selling morals to children, teaching lessons in line with the Cowboy Code. Good always triumphed over evil, but when reflecting on the Western, I think it's important to acknowledge how evil was often personified. Yes, you have outlaws, but more often than not, evil was represented by indigenous people. This trope is perhaps the most popular staple of the genre, and I think it's impossible to talk about cowboys and not address. The cowboy is a symbol of racial oppression. Their acts of heroism are acts of genocide. A culture was destroyed and the culprit was in control of the narrative. What stories were celebrated? What was good and what was evil? This is an archetype born out of myth, fabrications. The West was not as pop culture for so long presented it. Some names, like Wyatt Earp or Billy the Kid, have been given legendary status, while others are largely forgotten. Like Nate Love, a former slave whose self-aggrandizing rivaled that of Buffalo Bill. Boss Ickard, who participated in the earliest cattle drives and served as banker to Charles Goodnight, Texas's most prominent cattle rancher. Or John Ware, who first brought cattle to the province of Alberta, establishing an industry that today brings in nearly $4 billion annually. These are a few of the stories that managed to survive. Now, I'm not making this video to glorify the cowboy, nor is it my intent to guilt anybody. I just think in the world of fads that sometimes last hours, the idea that something could have maintained relevance for nearly a century is fascinating. The cowboy myth resonated so much that only the possibility of visiting other worlds could dethrone it as a national obsession. If you enjoyed this video, check out some of the others in this series, like our look at the climb a Nintendo face when arriving in America, or my inflammatory thoughts on the rodeo. If you haven't, please subscribe, and as always, thanks for watching.